All right, easy choice, fellas. Get the Vortex. Hey, what's up, fellas? Welcome back to the channel. It's Paul again, and today we're gonna make a quick video discussing one of the most requested questions I had on this channel. Hey, what's the difference between the Vortex PST 1-6 and the Vortex Razor 1-6 Gen 2E? As you guys may know from the previous videos, we have a lot of history with these two optics. We shot them a bunch over the years. Both of these optics were featured in the best LPVOs of 2022. I'll link to it if you haven't already seen it. So if you go with either of them, they're both excellent choices. So the question we want to answer in this video is, hey, if the Vortex PST is so good, considering they're both for 1-6s, why should I spend the money to spend it on a Vortex Razor? So I've seen some posts saying, hey, the Vortex PST is about 70–80% what the Razor is. So the next obvious question is, what makes up that last 20 or 30%? So if you want to find that out, we'll look at it in more detail here. First, we'll start with the externals on the outside, then we'll work our way inwards to the glass and performance where it really counts. So let's start with the profile differences between these two, because aesthetically you can pick them out pretty easily. So starting with the PST, it is the longer of the two. It's about 1 inch longer than the Razor, so it's pretty clear when you're looking at them side by side. Neither of them are under 10 inches, so if that's your main criteria, neither of the scopes for you, although the Razor is pretty close to that sub 10 inch group. So maybe take a look at that scope if that's your defining measure. So speaking of aesthetics, the PST is more traditional black color. So hey, it's slimming, goes with everything, so it's a perfect match. Vortex Razor is more of that purple bronze color. So that color, even though I like it personally, that color kind of doesn't go with anything, not even like FDE. So I know a lot of guys hate that. So if Vortex ever decided to do a black Razor, I think that would be really popular, just in my opinion. Now, one other note about the profile differences is the weight. So the Razor is about 1 ounce lighter than the PST. I don't really notice it when you're moving around that much. Although the Gen 2E is the model that we're looking at, that model is substantially lighter than the previous Razor Gen 2. So you will notice a difference if you're comparing those. But between the 2E and the PST, I don't think weight's gonna be a major factor. So since both these scopes come in at over 20 ounces, I think it's a really good idea to try to get the lightest scope mount you can find to keep the overall package as light as possible. In the past, we've used the Aero Precision Ultralights, which have worked really great for us. But if you need a more heavy duty and QD mount, we've also used the Warren X-Scale QDs, which you've seen on the channel. They're relatively low cost, and also they work really well. You've also seen us use the ScalarWorks mount, which is around 5 ounces, so a nice middle ground, although it is an expensive mount. So if you're looking for any scope mounts, I'll leave the links down below. I think all three of these are excellent choices for either the PST or the Razor. And by the way, since we're talking externals here, I do want to mention two control differences between them. On the PST, we'll start with the illumination knob. The illumination knob on the PST is great. It has 10 settings, but the Razor has 11 settings, so it's slightly more control on the Razor. They both have off positions, so there's not a big difference between the two there, but the Razor does have a locking lever. So once you set it on a setting, you push it in to lock it, it's not gonna move. So you bump it against something, running around in your truck bed, or it's rolling around in your rifle bag, it's not gonna move. Now, some people will say that doesn't really make a difference, because really the PST, like the friction between the numbers is strong enough to where it will likely hold. Now, where you will find a difference is in the zoom/magnification dial. So the PST is very stiff. It is so stiff that basically you can't really, if you're using it for a run and gun, you need enough distance between your short range and long range targets to give you time to go from 1 to 6x. Now, the external throw levers that you can use with this, I'm using this really cheap Monstrum aluminum throw lever, and it works okay-ish. To tell you the truth, it doesn't really work that much better than the really cheap breakaway coasters, but it is more slimming and is a lower profile, right? But for the Razor, which comes with the MGM switch view, it's much smoother and much faster than the PST. Now, it's not as smooth or as fast as the recent NX8, which is really super buttery smooth, but the Razor just one step below it. I know some dudes that were going to the Razor and feeling that throw lever, to them, that's worth the price difference between the two. So you have to decide if it's a major difference for you. For me, it is, definitely. All right, fellas, so if you're one of those who bought the Razor and I'm now wondering, hey man, did I lose my money? Did I waste it? Well, when we're talking glass quality and performance, this is where the Razor really starts to shine as the superior choice between the two. And the first place where that's most obvious as far as performance is its field of view and the thinness of the bezel. So you need those two combinations if you're looking for red dot performance. When you look at it on paper, the PST and the Razor are kind of close as far as a 1x field of view, but in practice, they're pretty far apart. Because on the Razor, you know, the field of view is so wide and also the bezel is so thin that anytime you have that combination, when you're just looking at a target for target focus, all you do is just focus on the target, smooth the sight picture over, and just overlay the red dot on top of the target and start pressing around as soon as you have the acceptable sight picture. So if you're moving from a red dot to an LPVO, I think having the Razor is the easiest transition of all the LPVOs in this price range. Now, that's not to say the PST is actually a bad scope. It's actually a very good performer at 1x. But the issue is that you can definitely notice that, hey, this bezel's pretty large, and also, you know, you get the sense that, hey, I'm looking down a scope onto the target. So what can you do? Well, number one, you really have to have very hard target focus in order to kind of avoid that barrel feeling. And number two, there is something you can do to help, like, shrink that barrel size, or, you know, make the bezel a little bit thinner. And what you can do is you can move the scope forward in its mount. So instead of mounting it closer to the charging handle, you can move it forward, and that will make the bezel quite a bit thinner and kind of a little bit closer to the Razor. But there's a caveat. So having it moving forward like this, yes, the bezel is thinner, but the only problem you have is when you start to spin it up to 6x, you'll notice that, oh, I have a lot of scope shadow now. So the PST's eye relief doesn't really support that kind of, you know, forward mounting of the optic. Really, you only have two choices. Either you can, number one, leave it up there, so when I move it up to 6x, so if this is my 1x view and I move it to 6x, I'm going to have to move my head forward in order to get a full sight picture. Or number two, I just move it back and go back to, hey, I'm going to see a larger bezel, and when I spin it up to 6x, I don't have to move my head, right? So when we're talking eye relief, really on paper, they're pretty close, like 0.2 inches of each other, but in practice, I think there's a more substantial gap between the two just because of that. So in contrast with the Razor, you have like kind of a much larger range where your cheek can land on the stock, and you'll have a very thin, nice bezel. And when you spin it up to 6x, you're going to have a full sight picture without moving your head. Now, when we're talking the other portion of the eye box, not just dealing with eye relief, but the side-to-side tolerance for a sight picture, shot both of these side by side on a VTech barricade around 2 to 3x magnification, and I really didn't notice any huge performance gaps between both the PST and the Razor. So I don't think you're going to notice that much difference too, just outside of the eye relief that I mentioned. So as far as edge clarity at 1x, I don't think you're going to notice huge differences between the two, although it is somewhat light depending on the PST. If there's light coming in from the front, notice that the PST gets a little bit more distorted toward the edges a little bit sooner than the Razor. So on the Razor, you know, it's almost edge quality, so maybe the last 10% or so. But really, like I said, just in most lighting conditions, I don't think you're going to find that much difference between the two at 1x. So speaking of light and daylight illumination, I don't think there's a huge difference between the two, especially in high noon conditions. So at brightest condition of 11 on the Razor and 10 on the PST, if you can stack them side by side, really, you can't really tell the difference. The only place you can really tell the difference is in low light. The Razor tends to bloom a little bit more at the highest power, so you can see parts of the reticle illuminated, but on the PST, it's a little bit more controlled toward the center, so only the center dot is illuminated. Now, as you zoom up to 6x, to compare like the image quality and the glass quality of the two, what you notice as far as color and contrast is the PST is a little bit warmer than the Razor. So the Razor is a little bit more bluish tone. That's not a big difference, I don't think. Although like when it gets a lower light, personally I like the bluer tone because it's a little bit easier to pick out targets in shadow and stuff like that. But the PST is perfectly fine for that kind of shooting. And when I'm doing a slow zoom, so just from going from 1 to 6x and stepping through them, I'm looking for like any image or resolution loss or any fuzziness, and I didn't notice any between either of those two. So they both hold their resolution and contrast just fine when you're moving from lowest to highest. But I did notice one difference between the two. I noticed the PST's image has a little bit more color fringing than the Razor. So it's not crazy like the NX8 that we looked at before, but there is some purple fringing on some of those targets. And as a reminder, you generally only see that on like black background against like high contrast white image. And you kind of see it here in some of the footage. But compared to the Razor, which is perfectly controlled for it, I didn't notice any color fringing on the Razor. And just one last note, since we were talking long range here, as far as reticle choices, they're both offer the same excellent reticle choices. So the VMR2 reticle is available in both MOA and MIL on both optics. So just choose which one you're more comfortable measuring. On the Razor, the JM1 BDC is available, and I've shot with that reticle and it works great. So I think if you're doing like run and gun and you want a simpler easy to remember holds, the JM1 BDC works great for that. But if you want a more featured reticle, both reticles are available for you depending upon what you want to do with your rifle. All right, fellas, so now that you know what that last 20 to 30% we're really talking about, only you can really decide if that's worth it, considering you can almost get 2 Vortex PSTs for the price of 1 razor, right? I will make this one point. I've known several dudes on the competition circuit who used to shoot the Vortex PST and now have upgraded to their razors, and this is several years ago, and today they're still shooting that razor. So I think if I just based on my informal survey, it might be the most winning 3-gun LPVO in history. So if that makes a difference to you, at least you have some stats there. Don't get me wrong, the Vortex PST is a great scope. As you've seen on this channel, we shot a ton. But if somebody said, hey man, what is the best run and gun scope that you can buy? As far as 1-6 is, for less than $1,500, the Vortex Razor is the answer, and it's still the king. And that's the final verdict. I hope it helped. And if you found this video helpful, then please leave a like and comment, because it really does help this small channel keep growing. And thanks again for coming back to this channel, and thanks again for watching this, and we'll see you guys again next time.